Imagine sailing the open ocean in the early 1700s, and on the horizon, you see a ship flying a black flag, a skeleton holding an hourglass in one hand and a spear pointed at a bleeding heart in the other. You freeze. Your crew freezes. Because everyone in the Atlantic world knew exactly what that flag meant. It meant Blackbeard was coming. And by the time you saw it, it was already too late. Today, we are mapping the voyages of the most terrifying pirate who ever lived. Not just telling you the stories, we are going to trace his exact routes, city by city, sea by sea, and coastline by coastline. From the warm waters of the Caribbean to the foggy inlets of the American colonies, we are following the wake of Edward Teach, the man the world called Blackbeard. So get comfortable, because Journey is going to take you across thousands of miles of open ocean, and every stop on this map has a story that will absolutely blow your mind. Before we set sail, I want you to understand something about Blackbeard that most people get completely wrong. He wasn't just some savage criminal who stumbled into piracy. This man was calculated, brilliant, and terrifyingly strategic. He understood geography better than most naval officers of his time. He knew which waters were patrolled, which colonies were corrupt, which governors could be bribed, and which shipping lanes carried the heaviest treasure. The routes he chose were never random. Every voyage, every raid, every anchorage was a deliberate move on a very dangerous chessboard. And when you map it all out, you start to see the genius hiding behind the legend. Let's begin where Blackbeard himself began, in the chaos of the post-war Atlantic. Around 1716, after the War of the Spanish Succession ended, thousands of sailors and privateers suddenly found themselves out of work. England had no more use for them. No more government-sanctioned raiding. No more letters of marque. Just unemployment and poverty. Edward Teach, likely born in Bristol, England, had been sailing these waters as a privateer, and when the war ended, he made a choice that thousands of others were also making. He turned to piracy. His first confirmed base of operations was the island of New Providence in the Bahamas. Picture it: Nassau in the early 1700s was essentially a pirate republic. No functioning government, a crumbling fort, and a harbor full of desperate, skilled sailors. This is where Blackbeard found his footing. This is where he met the pirate captain, Benjamin Hornigold, who would become his mentor and essentially hand him the keys to a career in terror. Nassau sits right at the crossroads of Atlantic shipping, and that location was everything. Ships coming from Europe, heading to the American colonies or back to England loaded with goods, had to pass through waters that were just a short sail from New Providence. Blackbeard and Hornigold began raiding right there, picking off vessels moving through the Bahamas and the waters north of Cuba. Now here's where the map starts to get interesting. Blackbeard didn't stay put. Unlike some pirates who operated out of a single base, he was constantly moving. By 1717, he and Hornigold were pushing north along the American eastern seaboard. They worked the shipping lanes, stretching from the Bahamas up through the waters off the Carolinas and Virginia. Think about what those waters looked like then: busy, largely unprotected, and carrying enormous wealth. Ships loaded with tobacco, sugar, rum, and manufactured goods were moving up and that coast constantly. Blackbeard was like a wolf watching a flock of sheep. Hornigold eventually accepted a royal pardon and stepped away from piracy. But Blackbeard didn't miss a beat. He had already been building his own reputation, and in late 1717, something happened that changed everything. He captured a large French slave ship called La Concorde near the island of Martinique in the eastern Caribbean. Martinique sits in the Lesser Antilles, that long chain of islands curving from the north down towards South America. Blackbeard took La Concorde, renamed her the Queen Anne's Revenge, armed her with 40 guns, and suddenly he wasn't leading a small sloop, he was commanding a warship. This single moment on the map near Martinique transformed Blackbeard from a capable pirate into an unstoppable force. With the Queen Anne's Revenge, his voyages grew bolder and far more ambitious. He began working the Eastern Caribbean, aggressively raiding near St. Vincent, terrorizing vessels near Hispaniola, pushing through the Windward Passage between Cuba and Hispaniola. That Windward Passage was one of the busiest shipping corridors in the entire Atlantic world. Ships heading from Europe to the Spanish Main, ships carrying silver and gold, ships loaded with provisions and enslaved people, they all moved through that narrow stretch of water. And Blackbeard was waiting. By early 1718, he started pushing his fleet north again. He had now assembled multiple ships and hundreds of men under his command. This wasn't a raiding party anymore. This was a fleet, and he sailed that fleet straight toward the coast of the American colonies. This decision alone tells you everything about his audacity. He wasn't hiding in remote Caribbean coves. He was sailing toward populated coastlines, toward colonial ports, toward places where governors lived and naval captains drank their evening tea. And then came the moment that still shocks historians, the blockade of Charleston. In May of 1718, Blackbeard anchored his fleet at the entrance to Charleston Harbor in South Carolina. Charleston was one of the most important ports in colonial America. Ships moved in and out of there, constantly carrying rice, indigo, furs, and luxury goods. And Blackbeard simply stopped all of it. He captured every vessel trying to enter or leave the harbor. He took hostages, including prominent citizens. And then he sent a message to the governor of South Carolina, demanding a chest of medicine, specifically mercury, used to treat syphilis, which was rampant among his crew. The governor, with no real option, complied. Blackbeard released the hostages and sailed away. He had just held an entire colonial city for ransom and walked away with what he wanted. Think about that on the map. This wasn't happening in some distant, lawless sea. This was happening at the doorstep of colonial civilization. Blackbeard had essentially told the entire British colonial establishment that he could go wherever he wanted and take whatever he pleased. After Charleston, he turned north. He headed toward the Outer Banks of North Carolina, that long, thin strip of barrier islands stretching along the coast. This region would become deeply associated with Blackbeard, and for good reason. The shallow inlets and hidden waterways of the Outer Banks were perfect for smaller pirate vessels. Deep draft naval warships couldn't follow without running aground. It was a natural maze, and Blackbeard knew it well. Near Beaufort Inlet, in June of 1718, the Queen Anne's ran aground. Whether this was an accident or a deliberate move by Blackbeard to shed excess crew and downsize his operation, nobody knows for certain. Historians have debated it for decades. What we do know is that Blackbeard lost his flagship there, and archaeologists actually found the wreck in 1996. The Queen Anne's Revenge is still there, resting in the shallow waters off Beaufort, North Carolina, and excavations have recovered cannons, anchors, medical instruments, and thousands of artifacts that still paint a vivid picture of life aboard that ship. After losing the Queen Anne's Revenge, Blackbeard took a smaller crew and accepted a pardon from the governor of North Carolina, Charles Eden. But this pardon was barely worth the paper it was written on. Within months, Blackbeard was back at it. He established a kind of informal headquarters at Ocracoke Island, a remote spot on the Outer Banks that was accessible by sea, but difficult to approach without local knowledge. He knew every shoal, every inlet, every current. Ocracoke became his base for the final chapter of his voyages. From Ocracoke, he continued raiding along the Carolina and Virginia coasts. He was essentially operating with the quiet tolerance of Governor Eden, who some historians believe was taking a cut of the pirate profits. The arrangement suited both men until it didn't. Governor Alexander Spotswood of Virginia had had enough. He saw Blackbeard not as a manageable nuisance, but as an existential threat to colonial trade and British authority. Spotswood organized a secret expedition using Royal Navy ships commanded by Lieutenant Robert Maynard to sail south and end it. This wasn't legal in the strict sense. Spotswood had no jurisdiction over North Carolina. He did it anyway. On November 21, 1718, Maynard's 2 sloops found Blackbeard's vessel anchored at Ocracoke Inlet. What followed was one of the most brutal close-quarters naval battles in colonial American history. Blackbeard and his crew were outnumbered and outgunned, but they fought like men who had nothing to lose. Blackbeard himself was shot 5 times and stabbed more than 20 times before he finally fell. Maynard had his head cut off and hung it from the bowsprit of his sloop as proof. The location matters here. Ocracoke Inlet, this quiet, obscure spot on the North Carolina coast, was where one of the most feared men in the Atlantic world drew his last breath. Not in some grand harbor, not in a dramatic sea battle on open water, but in a narrow inlet where the shallow water had always been his advantage, and on this one morning wasn't enough. When you map the full scope of Blackbeard's voyages from Nassau to Martinique, through the Caribbean, up to Charleston, along the Outer Banks, and finally to Ocracoke, you see a man who covered thousands of miles in just 2 years of active piracy. 2 years. His peak career lasted roughly from 1716 to 1718, and in that time, he became the most famous and feared pirate in the Atlantic world. He raided dozens of ships. He commanded fleets. He blockaded cities. He negotiated with governors. He built a legend so powerful that 300 years later, people are still mapping his voyages, still diving on his wreck, still writing books and making films about him. What made Blackbeard truly remarkable wasn't just his violence, it was his understanding of the ocean as a system. He moved through it strategically, using geography as a weapon. The shallow inlets of North Carolina protected him. The busy shipping lanes of the Caribbean fed him. The political corruption of colonial governors shielded him. He read the world around him and exploited every weakness he found. That is the real lesson hiding inside this map. Blackbeard didn't just sail the Atlantic, he understood it in a way that very few people of his era did. And that understanding is what made him dangerous, legendary, and ultimately unforgettable. If you made it this far through Blackbeard's entire mapped journey, drop a comment telling me which stop surprised you the most. Was it the blockade of Charleston? The Queen Anne's revenge near Martinique? Or that final battle at Ocracoke? I read every single comment, and I genuinely want to know what hit you hardest. If you found this video valuable, share it with one person who loves history, because channels like this grow one passionate viewer at a time, and your support means everything. Hit subscribe if you haven't already, because we have a lot more deep dives into the stories that history books barely scratch the surface of. The ocean has more secrets, and we are just getting started.